are engaged in far off conflicts, which gives you some kind of picture of what the northern kingdom of Israel was like within the larger context. Here's an interesting find which points to the instability of the 9th century in Israel. Discovered by Naama Yahalom Mak, shown here, is this fascinating figurine. We just discovered a few years ago here, and the crown around his head there indicates he's clearly of royalty. Very beautifully preserved, little 5-centimeter figurine. Now, the big question is, though, he's clearly a king. Which king is he? So just looking at this period alone, it's possible that he could be an Israelite king. This was discovered in the northern part of Israel, which had fallen under sway of the Syrians in Aram. I'll show you a map in just a second. It could have been one of the kings of the kingdom of Israel, as mentioned in the Korch obelisk. Could have been Achab. It could have been his son Yehu, who mounted a ill-fated rebellion. It could have been one of the kings of Aram that had invaded Israel as the regional treaties between the various 12 kings began to break apart. Could have been Ben-Hadad or Hazael, which were the foreign kings that ended up dominating the northern part of Israel. Or it could have been a king of Tyre, perhaps Itobal. All of these are possibilities, and it gives you a sense of what kind of chaos was going on in Israel, with tremendous dynastic upheaval and regional conflict and foreign invasion and so on. Okay, I've kept you waiting long enough. Let's have a look at the map and try to sort these things out. I'm going to focus on the invasion of 720 from the Assyrians, and we will follow up with some detailed discussion in the next 2 videos. But I want to give you a sense not only of that, but also its relationship to the Babylonian invasion that would occur another couple hundred years later. So here's our heroes in Jerusalem and Samaria, the kingdom of Judah, of course, in the south, with its capital at Jerusalem. And we will return, of course, to have a much longer discussion of Jerusalem and Judah in subsequent videos. And then in the north, with the capital in Samaria, you have the kingdom of Israel. Now, to their north is a larger regional kingdom, the kingdom of Aram, at times in alliance with either Israel or even with Judah, and at times hostile. And in fact, in the period that we're describing now, this is when Aram would invade the kingdom of Israel and dominate it significantly. But further north, and remember, this northern trend is all following the Fertile Crescent. So it kind of curves around an open-ended hairpin turn and then begins to go to the south following the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. You have the kingdom of Assyria, with its base in the very old city of Nineveh, famous from the book of Jonah. And ultimately, Aram would get into trouble with Assyria and would be conquered by Assyria. Are you getting the image now of kind of like the little fish is eaten by the bigger fish, is eaten by the still bigger fish, and so on? If you aren't, think about that, because that's exactly what's going to happen here. Aram will swallow up northern Israel, and then Assyria will end up swallowing up Aram, and with it, northern Israel. And then the biggest fish, which we're going to come back to in a few lectures from now, is, of course, Babylonia. The Babylonian Empire, centered in the city known as Babylon, would eventually take over Assyria, which had taken over Aram, which had taken over northern Israel. They would have huge consequences for the history of the Jews. Let us also mention, however, with the Assyrian invasion, there are 2 really important population transfers. That's kind of a neutral term. From the perspective of Israel, this is the exile of the 10 northern tribes that we're going to talk about in the very next video. I said that so many times this video, but you get the idea. All these things are all happening at the same time. According to the biblical account and from some fascinating non-biblical sources, the Jews from the northern region of Israel, and it's not the entire population, as we've mentioned a couple of times. It is several tens of thousands and particular segments of the socioeconomic profile of the Kingdom of Israel. They are exiled to places like Gozan, the river Chabor, the capital region in Nineveh, and then further to the east to the region of the Medes. These are all where we know that the 10 tribes, or the representatives of the 10 tribes, were exiled to, and we'll follow those up in the very next video. At the same time, part of the Assyrian strategy for dominating their conquered regions, which we see in other parts of their history as well, is not only to remove the local leadership, the elite that could potentially organize a rebellion, but to bring into the region a foreign population that destabilizes a lot of the local relationships and alliance and so on. And this would be the population known as the Samaritans, who probably come from the region called Kuta. There are some questions about their origins, but Kuta is where, according to the dominant opinion, the Assyrians took their local population, conquered from the south, and forcibly shipped them to Israel to center around Samaria. In fact, in Talmudic Aramaic, the Samaritans are typically called Kutim, which is plural for Kuthites, people who come from this region. Okay, so that's what's going to happen after 720. We're going to pick it up by looking at the story of those yellow arrows in the next video. What happened to the 10 lost tribes? Thank you very much for watching. Let's just start with what we know from the biblical text and from Assyrian documentation as well. So it seems there were 3 major periods of deportation in the late 8th century. The first was under Tiglath-Pileser III, known in Tanakh, in the Hebrew scriptures, as King Pul, and this was in the 730s. Records indicate in a few different places, when you add them up, something like 13,250 Jews were taken from the northern part of the land of Israel. Those of you who are watching this video without watching previous ones will know that I tend to use the term Jews anachronistically. Just forgive me for it. Most Jews do that. At any rate, about 13,250 exiles. Appears that all of them were males, were taken from the northern region. It appears also that Jews had some experience, as we saw in the last lecture, in the military field in particular. They may have excelled especially in charioteering, and it could be that, just supposition, that perhaps he took some men of military age over families and things like that. Then we have a second period under Shalmaneser V and his son Sargon. Shalmaneser is on the left, and the figure on the right is believed to be Sargon II. We have a much more specific number from their records of 27,280, or elsewhere 27,290, and this occurred in the years 722 through 720, and would have affected the area around Samaria itself. This is a really hard specific number that feels a lot more real than a lot of the numbers that you see in some of these documents. And then finally, you have King Sancherib in Hebrew, or Sennacherib in English, who claims to have removed 200,000 Jews, a very, very large number, from the region of Judah at the very end of the 8th century. We'll talk more about that 2 lectures from now. At any rate, these are the 3 major deportations that we're speaking about. It is interesting to note that the evidence from the biblical text and also from ostraka that are discovered in the region where they were resettled suggests that the Jews who were taken away were not, in fact, enslaved, but nevertheless, they were forcibly required to remain in these places. And, let's continue the story from there. So what exactly happened to them? Again, based on the biblical text and a few little bits and pieces in other sources, we see that the Jews from the kingdom of Israel itself, that is the 10 northern tribes, were sent off to these 3 locations. Hamath, which is somewhere in northern Lebanon, western Syria. the region of Gozan and nearby river, which as you can see is the middle circle here, and then finally out to the newly conquered region of the Assyrian Empire in Media. What happened to the Jews when they got there? So we have scattered onomastic evidence, which I love these words. Onomastic means proper names, meaning we see evidence of people with Semitic and sometimes definitively Hebrew names, especially because of the theophoric nature of many Hebrew names. Theophoric is another good word. It means like it involves the name of God, like Jews like including the name of God in their children's names. Several of my children have one of the several names of God built into their names itself. Like, for example, a common name, Michael, not the name of one of my kids, but means Michael, which is who is like God, right? So it's very common to have a name like that. Or Kal-El, for example, Clark Kent. So when you look at some of the ostraka that are discovered, such as this one discovered in the city of Nimrud, dating from the late 7th century. Often the texts are in Aramaic, very rarely in Hebrew, and there's clearly some Hebrew names, or at least Semitic names included there. Just little bits of pieces of what this might mean. Sometimes these ostraka indicate that there are Jews there, or potential Jews, who were active as charioteers. As I mentioned earlier, there seems to have been some history of Jews involved in that particular aspect of the military. There's one possible Jew who was named as a village manager, again, supporting the idea that they were hardly enslaved when they were out there, that they had the possibility of rising to positions of administrative authority. And one especially fascinating passage that refers to a Hosea, very Jewish name, who redeems a woman named Dinah from slavery, right, paying a ransom for it. This is especially interesting because there is a very long-standing tradition of redeeming captives as a high-value mitzvah, or a commandment that devolves upon Jews that basically says that you have to drop everything to try and redeem someone from slavery. At any rate, these are kind of like just little bits and pieces that suggest that, yes, the story has historic validity. Jews were living in these regions, that the biblical text and the Assyrian documentation coincides, but unfortunately we don't know a lot about what exactly happened to them. If we look at the map with contemporary political boundaries overlaid, we see that these exiles would have been settled in northern Lebanon, southern Syria, which is not terribly far away from Israel. It's easily conceivable that they could have migrated back over centuries. We see them on the border of Turkey and Syria, perhaps in the Kurdish regions, and we see them out in western Iran as well. So most historians assume that the vast majority of these exiles simply assimilated into the larger populations in which they lived. This is actually a very common element of Jewish history, particularly in the diaspora, where Jews over a period of generations simply lose their attachment to their ancestral peoplehood and simply blend in with the populations around them. There are some very significant exceptions, and when we get a little further on in this class and we start talking about the post-Roman exile after the First Roman-Jewish War, and especially after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Jews began to develop actual social strategies to maintain their group integrity, which stood them very well over the next 2,000 years, preserving their integrity as a social group, but not perfectly. So, and by the way, going backwards in time, there is a long-standing midrash that says that 80% of the Jews living in Egypt chose not to leave with the Exodus. That is, only 20% of the population actually took Moses up on his word and followed him out into the desert and ultimately into Israel. So the story of Jewish assimilation into the background population is very common and very plausible. However, this rabbit hole goes really deep. And I don't want to take it very far in this particular lecture, but I hope to return to it several times as we go through the entire saga of the Jewish history, because the legend of the 10 lost tribes has been a dominant motivating idea that you see in all kinds of Jewish movements. For example, the movement of the 20th century Hasidic Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, shown here, who is one of the greatest leaders of the Chabad movement, and in reality, one of the greatest leaders of the Jewish people in modern times, who mounted several campaigns specifically to find assimilated Jews and also to reach out to non-Jews and to educate them, at the very least, in their connection to the Noahide commandments, and possibly to uncover people who wanted to convert, although that was never an explicit goal, because after all, Judaism is not a proselytizing religion, with one significant exception that we'll get to in about 4 or 5 lectures from now. At any rate, they're based very heavily on this idea in Hebrew of the kibbutz galulios, the gathering together of the exiles, which you find several times in the biblical text. I give you one verse here from the book of Ezekiel, Yechezkel. I will take the children of Israel, right? Notably, the Bnei Yisrael is the Hebrew term used there, but it has that feeling of the northern kingdom as well, from among the nations where they have gone, and I will bring them from all around and return them to their land. This idea of the ingathering of the exiles is a very powerful notion that runs its way through Jewish civilization to the present day. We see it also in the secular Zionist movement, headed perhaps most famously by Theodor Herzl, shown in this postcard, which has written in Hebrew and then in German and then in French the phrase, "If you will it, it is no dream." Meaning, if you want to all come back to Israel and create a state there, of course, this was stated before Israel as a modern entity became a reality in 1948. Then you have this image of this angelic creature breaking the chains, and with the flag emblazoned with the Star of David, gathering in all of these tired, oppressed, hungry masses to the land of Israel. This is something that really comes essentially from the legends of the 10 lost tribes. Now, what did people think of it in the ancient period? We see the assertion of socially intact tribes in many sources around the 1st century before the Common Era and the 1st century in the Common Era. Josephus and Paul and James in the Christian scriptures are especially noteworthy for their adherence to the idea that the 10 tribes still exist. Again, this would be 700 years later after the exile, in their units, that they actually still maintain their tribal identities in Iran and Iraq and so on. Rabbi Eliezer, of course, in the more mainstream Jewish tradition, also held that the 10 lost tribes are still there, intact and waiting. Other opinions, however, and this is typical of the Talmud, that you will have multiple opinions. The very famous and very authoritative Rabbi Akiva says the 10 tribes are not coming back. He argued that once they were taken away, they assimilated into the nations beyond them, and they are not going to be pulled out, certainly not in their tribal units. You'll see that in the Mishnah. There is also a discussion in the Jerusalem Talmud, again, more when we get later on in the series, as to what is the Jerusalem as opposed to the Babylonian Talmud, that discusses this amazing river Sambation, which was apparently a river that was impassable during the 6 days of the week because it had all these rolling rocks that would run through the ravine rather than water, and it was impossible to cross safely. But on the Sabbath, this mystical river Sambation would suddenly rest, but because of the laws of traveling on the Sabbath, the Jews, the 10 tribes, would not be able to cross it and make their way back to Israel. Fascinating kind of things. What I will just mention here now is one of the many, literally dozens of theories that developed over the next few millennia as to who the 10 lost tribes are. Who did they become? So for one example, it's just one of many, really. You have them in Japan, you have them in England, in Africa, all kinds of places. There's a testimony of a crypto-Jewish traveler named Antonio de Montesinos, who was Portuguese and who had outwardly accepted Catholicism in the context of the Inquisition, and like many of his socioeconomic and religious class, left Portugal to travel the world and look for a safer haven. He came to Ecuador, and then amazingly, as he recounted when he came back, he was greeted by the native population there with the Shema prayer. Right? Hear, O Israel, Lord our God, the Lord is one. Astounding. And he believed that he had come across the 10 tribes that had relocated to far off Ecuador. There were other signs as well. They gave him Jewish food like chicken soup and egg rolls. No, I made that part up, but I couldn't help it. I haven't had lunch yet. And he came back to Amsterdam, and he reported this to a very important rabbi, Manasseh ben Israel, who was so taken with the idea that he wrote a book. It was translated into English ultimately as The Hope of Israel, Mikveh Yisrael, in which he argued that, the country of England should readmit the Jews because we are now in the flourishing of the Messianic period when the 10 lost tribes are being discovered. This was central to the thesis, and it created quite a stir, especially when it was translated into English, and many other works were produced that supported it, such as this interesting one here that I find especially interesting: Jews in America, or probabilities that those Indians are Judaical, made more probable by some additionals to the former conjectures. An argument that the Native Americans are in fact the 10 lost tribes. One of many, many theories as to what became of the 10 lost tribes. Okay. I really intend to come back to this topic later on in this series because it actually plays an important role in many significant, especially pseudo-messianic movements throughout Jewish history. But for the time being, I want to thank you very much for watching. The next video will look at the origins of the Samaritans in Israel. Thanks again for watching. Let us just look at one more aspect of 8th century Israel before we move on to a discussion of the Babylonian period. One of the fascinating chapters, in some places it's just a footnote, in other places it's extremely important, is the Samaritan community, which has a fascinating origin story, actually multiple origin stories, and the intersection between the Samaritans and the mainstream Jewish community are quite significant in the ancient world. Let's have a look at who these people are and where they came from. So the Samaritans are quite an old people. They certainly stretch back into biblical times, and there are still several hundred of them living in Israel today, centered around the city of Nablus. In Hebrew, the name of that town is Shechem, and especially Mount Gerizim, Har Gerizim, which is also figured in the Bible and has some extremely important moments throughout its history. Where did they come from? Who are these Samaritans? So the biblical account of their origins is described in the second book of Kings, chapter 17, towards the end, where there's a discussion of the exiles of the Israelite nations, the 10 tribes from the northern kingdom going out to Babylon. We talked a little bit about that in the previous video. At the same time, there was a population transfer. This was a very well-known Assyrian technique to try and control their rapidly expanding empire. They would take out, especially the elite, the leadership of a particular community, and they would transplant another community with limited ties, with different loyalties, a minority, and it would break up the traditional power structures. So they brought in, as described in the book of Kings, people from the region of Babylon. That's a city. Babylonia is the region or the empire, and a city called Kuta, which will be significant because the Samaritans in Talmudic literature will be called Kutim, meaning those who come from Kuta. And they settled them in the region of Samaria to replace much of the local population for reasons that we have discussed. Now, that is basically the Jewish account as described in the Bible. The Samaritans, on the other hand, have a different account. There are several of them, but one of the most well-known is that actually they believe they go back to the original 10 tribes of Israel. They were Jews like all the other Jews, but there was a conflict over who was going to be the high priest. And Eli, who figures very prominently at the beginning of the book of Samuel, he took the Aron Kodesh, the tabernacle with the tablets of the law in them, and moved them south to Shiloh, away from Har HaGrizim, from Nablus, and created a separate religion altogether, which we now call Judaism. The original inhabitants, the Samaritans, say they just kept moving along with their original Torah, and so they don't hold with any of this foreign importation theory. They believe that they are actually the original Israelites who are observing the old-time religion, and it is the rest of the population of Israel who are the innovators who have perverted the traditional religion. It's fascinating, and of course the material goes so far back, there are no written sources for this, but nevertheless this is a very different account of their origins. Not surprisingly, the Samaritans and the Jews, the people living in Judah and Benjamin, and the people living now in the Assyrian-dominated northern part, the northern kingdom of Israel, are not getting along so well. There's all kinds of conflicts between them that just expand over the centuries, as we shall encounter as we go through these lectures. But we should note that the religion that the Samaritans practice is very similar to Judaism in a lot of ways. They have, for example, a Torah, which is in many ways really close to the Torah that the Jews revere. It also shows evidence of being closer to the Greek translation of the Torah, a few other interesting things like that. But obviously there are massive diversions. For example, the 10 commandments are actually the 9 commandments, because a few of them are combined to get a smaller count, although coveting is actually increased. They made coveting a little bigger and separated out different kinds of coveting. But commandment number 10 is wholly new. It isn't in the Jewish Torah, and that is the reverence for Mount Gerizim. And of course, on that holy mountain, they still practice a lot of the ancient rituals that Jews associate with Har Zion, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Fascinating kind of differences between them. Also, huge difference, the Samaritans lack the oral Torah, which is so central to understanding Judaism. We're going to come back to that in about 4 lectures or so and try to understand what is the oral Torah, how does it shape the Jewish approach to their religion, and so on. But for the time being, the Samaritans have a kind of a parallel Torah, but without the oral Torah. And as you can see, even from their mode of dress, holding up the Sefer Torah, there are certain similarities that, harmonies between them. That harmony was not always achieved in real life. We're going to talk about the ongoing conflict with the Samaritans as we move through the Babylonian and the Roman period in particular. But for now, I'd just like to point out a couple things. First of all, in the Talmud, there is a long-ranging debate that seems to take a couple centuries to resolve on the question of who are these Kutim? Who are these people, the Samaritans? Again, they're named in the Talmudic tradition after the city of Kuta. There's a body of rabbis who feel that, no, they did actually accept the Torah when they came to the land of Israel. Other rabbis, pointing once again to the Book of Kings, say that their conversion was motivated by fear. According to the biblical account, they were attacked by lions. They weren't sure what to do about it. So and conversion was a way of saving themselves. And so some rabbis would say that the conversion is not valid. And so there's a long debate going on. There's some really interesting discussions there. Do you count them, for example, as a quorum to say the special prayers when saying a blessing after a meal? Do they count in that or not? Essentially, do they count in a minyan? Fascinating kind of questions. In the end, the conclusion is no, the rabbis do not consider the Kutim to be Jews, but the fact that they have this long-running discussion is indicative of how close they came to that status. There's ongoing political and social tensions, in particular when there is a triangular power relationship, when there is a third party like the Persians or like the Greeks or like the Romans who are involved, and the Samaritans and the Jews sometimes find themselves jockeying against each other for power within a larger context. And there's some fascinating stories also, according to the Talmud, about the Samaritans interfering with some basic Jewish communications, such as lighting fires on the top of mountains as signal flares to indicate the beginning of a new month. By the sighting of the moon in Jerusalem, but lighting them at different times, which threw off the communication system completely. It's kind of like people, making prank calls or something like that, or robocalls. Well, maybe not exactly robocalls, but you get the idea. One last detail, which comes from the 1st century, from the Christian scriptures, which gives you an indication of how the Samaritans regarded. It is, of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan. In English, the term Good Samaritan means someone who goes out of his way to help out. There are hospitals named after the Good Samaritan and so on. The parable goes in the book of Luke that there's this guy who's like mugged and bleeding on the road. And you can see here in this particular picture by Van Cort Bende. I don't know who that is, but I think it's a fascinating picture. And several other Jewish figures walk past him, right? He's a Jewish guy lying, bleeding on the road. And there is a Kohen who walks by and says, oh, I don't want to get involved. And there's a Levite who walks by and says, no, I don't want to get involved. And it is the Samaritan who steps up and says, oh my gosh, this man is hurt. I better take care of him. He picks him up, takes him to an inn, and so on. When you read that story, the important note is that when the gospel was written, the Samaritans were basically the enemies of the Pharisees. They were people that they never got along with. And the point in the book of Luke is that it is the Samaritan. It is the person you would least likely to help out who actually helps the stranger. And the other people let him down. And so it is a good Samaritan, with the emphasis on the word Samaritan. Or if you want, it's a good Samaritan as opposed to all the others. That's so surprising about the book of Luke. We're going to talk a lot more about reading the Christian scriptures from a Jewish perspective in a few lectures, but for the time being, I just wanted to leave it here. Okay, we're going to come back to the Samaritans a lot as we go through the Persian and the Greek and the Roman period. But for now, I just want to say thanks very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this brief video. Where we left off in the biblical narrative, the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed, and a significant number of its population, most likely males, leadership level, involved in the military, perhaps in crafts, have been taken off to exile in Assyria. There still remains the southern kingdom known as Judah that will retain some degree of self-governance between the years that it is invaded by King Sennacherib in the year 701 before the Common Era, until it will be invaded by Nebuchadnezzar in the year 586. So let's turn now to the south and try to understand what happened to Judah in these crucial years between the Assyrian invasion and later the Babylonian invasion. So the king that is responsible for invading Judah at this point is Sennacherib. He ruled from the year 705 to the year 681, and 701 is the key year for his invasion of Judah. The invasion is actually recorded not only in the Bible, in the Book of Kings, but also in the monumental records of the Assyrians, a number of prisms, such as this one shown here, the Jerusalem prism, that specifically mentions the siege of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem itself was not destroyed. That is not a fate that was met by Lachish, a nearby major city in Israel that was completely devastated by Sennacherib. And here you can see in Assyrian records a series of Jews who were taken captive in Lachish and brought before the king to show their obeisance. Just giving you a sense of what it must have been like to have been conquered by Sennacherib at the time. Judah prepares for the onslaught under King Hezekiah by creating a number of defenses which ultimately would not be successful, but fascinatingly constructing a new or perhaps improved secure water supply. Because Jerusalem is on a mountaintop, it has some natural defenses based on the geography, but it's also at a loss in the case of a siege, which was something that happened to Jerusalem multiple times throughout its millennial history. And so King Chizkiyahu creates a new water diversion aqueduct. It may have been a renovation of an earlier one, but it was found in the 19th century. These Siloam tunnels that allowed the inhabitants of Jerusalem to last a little longer in these terrible sieges that would occur. At any rate, this is the status of Jerusalem, invaded and dominated by Sancherib, but not necessarily destroyed outright, as we saw in the northern kingdom. The kingdom of Judah retains a level of self-government and owes vassalage to Sancherib, meaning paying tribute and taxes and some humiliating rituals as well. But nevertheless, Judah manages to retain some kind of political independence, at least at some level, between the years 701 and 586, when the Babylonians would destroy it. This is a golden age for prophecy in Judah. There's a tremendous number of prophets who are active at the time and whose sayings and teachings were recorded in the Hebrew Bible. Two of the most famous are Isaiah, Yeshayahu in Hebrew, who is shown here in this remarkable ceiling painting by Tiepolo that shows a famous scene at the very beginning of the book of Isaiah, where an angel burns Isaiah's mouth because he speaks poorly of his compatriots. And this is kind of like an interesting dynamic that happens among the prophets. Some of them are like royal prophets that speak directly to kings and appear to be somehow associated with the court of kings to put them on the straight and narrow. And others seem to be like just popular wandering teachers who inform the population of their wrongdoings and of their need to repent and so on. There are a huge number of barely named prophets in the Bible, and the allusion to much larger groups who have no name whatsoever. Prophecy seems to have been some kind of like moral enterprise that was very, very common in Judah. Isaiah is among the most famous of them. Also note in this interesting painting that he's holding open a codex, an early book. Highly unlikely he would have a book in this form. More likely it would be a scroll. But also unlikely is it the author's attempt to perhaps draw Paleo-Hebrew characters. That is the earliest Hebrew alphabet that we have from this period. It's actually gibberish. Those are not letters at all. Other artists, such as Raphael, shown here, portrayed Isaiah more accurately, at least in terms of his Hebrew literacy. This particular painting, which has Greek on the top and a very Christological kind of reference, and some carefully placed little white blocks with titles in them. And you can see he's holding up a scroll, which actually has, in Hebrew, a passage from the book of Isaiah. It is slightly strangely written, like the spaces between the words are not well defined. And if you look at the first word there, it says pischu, which means open up. But the final letter is written just a little bit wrong. It looks a little bit like a resh, which is a nonsense word. But nevertheless, at least there's a much greater attempt here. I'm quite fascinated with who exactly wrote this Hebrew. Was it someone imitating a Hebrew script? Was it someone who was personally knowledgeable, a scribe? I don't know. But at any rate, you can see that there are more attempts to make a more greater fidelity to the Hebrew original. Also, prophets like Jeremiah, who prophesied for several decades at the very end of the period that we're describing today. And it's kind of like alternating between speaking to kings and speaking to the broader population. Not an especially well-liked man, because these prophets are bringing along messages of doom and at the same time demanding that everyone repent, everyone give up their false idols. And of course, there's quite a bit of idolatry going on in Israel at the time with very limited success. And after all, Jeremiah was doomed to witness the Babylonian exile itself, which we're going to discuss in the next video. So this is a period of tremendous activity of the prophets, giving us biblical texts of phenomenal power and resonance. It is possible that the texts themselves were not at all written down in this period. That is let's say the 8th century and the 7th century before the Common Era, the early 6th century, but they were memorized and later actually codified into the texts we have in the later Persian period that we'll speak about in a little while, by the students and the schools of these prophets, as they strove to solidify the teachings of their predecessors. You see this especially because some of the books, Isaiah and Jeremiah in particular, seem disjointed and out of sync with historical political elements. And many recent readers have suggested that perhaps they were kind of composed like greatest hits of Jeremiah, rather than composing them in a chronological sequence to fit with the national political issues of the day. Rearranging the book actually makes it much easier to understand Jeremiah's life in a biographic form, which is absolutely fascinating. It is also worthy of note that you see that the prophets in Judah played a national role in the sense that they spoke to major geopolitical events, and at the same time they were very much focused on the ground basic morality and decency and conduct, and wrote about that or spoke about that in very, very sharp terms. Powerful readings for the contemporary era, had a phenomenal impact on the development of Jewish thought over the millennia. One of the persons who was most deeply affected, perhaps, is one of the last kings of Judah, known as Josiah, or in Hebrew, Yoshiyahu. A fascinating backstory. He was kind of secluded as a child, became king at a very young age, and very sincere kind of individual. And at one point, he was moved to renovate the grounds of the temple, and they found, this is described in the book of Kings 2, chapter 22, they found in the temple a book. Some commentators think it was the full Torah, which is kind of strange, given like what was it doing until now. Others say it was just the 5th book of Deuteronomy, which is
Yo, dog. Can you hear me? Yo, baby. Welcome. How are you? Good to see you.
Is also called Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah, because it goes back and kind of summarizes many of the main ethical precepts or mitzvot commandments of the earlier four books. But Josiah says, okay, let's hear, what does the book say? And the book is opened, according to the rabbinic teachings, a passage that is one of the most horrible set of curses in the entire Torah, the Tochacha, which describes how the Jews will be punished for their idolatry and so on. And Josiah, realizing how far they have strayed from the teachings of the Torah, he tears his cloak in mourning, right? This is a basic mourning ritual. And he institutes a wide-ranging series of reforms in Judah to try and get it on the straight and narrow. This is also something we see in the biblical text that, especially in the book of Kings as opposed to the book of Chronicles, there's sort of like an epitaph for every king. This was a good king. He did what God wanted. This was a bad king. He strayed from the word of God. Back and forth, this kind of oscillation. It tends to be more black and white, although some of the kings are decidedly mixed in their approaches. But King Yoshiyahu is clearly one of the good ones, kind of bringing the Jews back towards the old-time faith of Judaism, as it were. He also was a very successful military leader, and as you can see, he took advantage of some of the major tensions between Assyria and Egypt and actually struck out to the north and expanded the territory of Judah into the region of Israel. Unfortunately, he died in these battles, and Judah could not hold on to this territory. Now, I want to just turn to one last thing from this period that I find absolutely fascinating. I have given you a fairly standard traditional treatment of the ancient history of the Jews, and I have qualified that from time to time in the light of contemporary scholarship that sort of tries to thread the needle between maximalists, who basically take the Bible exactly at its word for specific historic events, and that the Bible strives for historicity, meaning it strives to describe in factual terms that we understand today, rather than, let's say, poetic terms or other deviations from what we might consider the chronological record. And on the other hand, the minimalists who say, hey, the archaeological record is so thin. How can you even assume that any of this happened? We saw earlier that, the golden era of the United Monarchy of Saul, David, and Solomon leaves hardly a trace in the archaeological record. You have the Tel Dan Stele, which is 150 years later. You have the House of David existed, but what exactly was that? So many historians have opted to consider everything before the Omerides in the 9th century basically fiction. And it's in my humble opinion, it's a little bit of an intellectual hubris to say that simply because I have not found any evidence other than the biblical text to prove that X, Y, or Z happened, I'm going to assume it's not true. That is, it's not a mathematically conservative position. It is an overreach and denying the value of the Bible as a historical source. So why I'm saying this to you now is because occasionally archaeologists discover a tiny little thread that connects us to the past in such a powerful way that hammers home the idea that, oh my gosh, this actually happened. This is real. And every single discovery makes a huge difference. Have a look at this one. This is fantastic. This is a parking lot in Jerusalem, or a former parking lot in Jerusalem. As you can imagine, in the Holy City, there is a tremendous amount of archaeological work going on. And so this parking lot was discovered to actually be set on top of a major archaeological site. So in 2019, a dig at this site discovered an amazing thing. This bulla, which is essentially a kind of a stamp that would be used on clay, says it belongs to Natan Melech, servant of the king. Very interesting. And if you look at the second book of Kings, chapter 23:11, we see that King Yoshiyahu had a servant who is named, once in the Bible, named Natan Melech. So it's exactly the right name, found in exactly the right place, and helps us confirm the validity of the Bible as a historical source. Fascinating. I love when we find things like this. At any rate, the story will not end well at the end of this lecture, because the Babylonian Empire is going to take over from Assyria, and they are going to invade Israel as well. This invasion occurs at the beginning of the 6th century before the Common Era, and that's when we have the next great exile of the Jews, this time primarily from Judah, to Babylon, and that's where we'll pick up the story in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. The Babylonian exile would be fairly short-lived, less than a century, but would be highly consequential for Jewish history. Let's have a quick look at this brief period of time that had a major impact on the development of Jewish thought and Jewish religiosity, and of course the story of the Jewish people. This 19th century painting is inspired by the famous Psalm 137 that begins with the phrase, "By the rivers of Babylon," which describes the Jews being taken off into exile. You can see here the patriarch of the clan is wearing a shackle on his wrist. And there we sat down, the psalm goes on, and we wept when we remembered Zion. Meaning when they remembered their homeland in Judah. And they were forced by their Babylonian captors to sing them a song of Zion. So hence the harp there that's being held by the patriarch, and everyone is very sad. And indeed, this passage is a very moving depiction of the sadness and frustration and anger that the Jews felt at being displaced from their homeland by Nebuchadnezzar. The conqueror, of course, was Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Here you see an arrowhead that was discovered in the region. There's extensive evidence of destruction throughout the land of Judah. Benjamin, however, was apparently not devastated to the same degree, which indicates that it may have surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar without violence. But there's extensive evidence of the incursion of the Babylonians into the region, wreaking havoc beginning in 604 before the Common Era. There are some attempts at revolt against Nebuchadnezzar, and one of the ways in which the Babylonians respond is through progressively exiling the leadership of the region, although it's still a comparatively small number, less than 5,000. If you look, for example, in the book of Jeremiah, there is some indication that, as we saw earlier with Sancherib's exiles, that the leadership and also skilled craftsmen and potentially military personnel were especially targeted for these expulsions to Babylon. There was no, however, corresponding influx of population, as we saw under the Assyrians. The goal was to simply displace those people who might influence the population to continue their revolt without necessarily transplanting new populations in their place. But we have massive destruction, particularly in the final campaign that begins in the year 587 and will culminate in the destruction of the temple. Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the temple is one of the most prominent dates in Jewish history. It's usually associated with the year 586 before the Common Era, but in the Jewish psyche, it is huge. It is there's a whole series of dates that are associated with the siege beginning, the breaching of the walls, and ultimately the burning of the temple. And those dates are actually incorporated into the Jewish liturgical calendar with a series of fasts beginning in the summer and culminating in the late summer on the date of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Av, which usually falls in late July or early August of the Gregorian calendar. And this whole period, the 3 weeks between the breaching of the walls and the destruction of the temple, is observed as a form of semi-mourning by Jews, even to this day, with the limitation on certain types of celebrations. Some communities will refrain from haircuts and so on, listening to live music, all kinds of restrictions meant to reflect upon the horrendous meaning of the destruction of the temple in this year. This is Solomon's temple, of course, that we're discussing, and this entire period from Solomon's creation of the temple, which would have been in the 10th century up until its destruction in the 6th century, is collectively referred to as First Temple period. The Second Temple would refer to the rebuilding of the temple under Cyrus, which we'll discuss in a couple of videos. At any rate, one more element that's especially important to note is that Nebuchadnezzar placed a person in charge, a Jewish leader in charge of the entire community, with the hopes that this individual, Gedaliah ben Achikam, would calm the local population and keep them from any further revolts. But he was actually killed in an assassination by other Jewish leaders, by people who were more hot-headed and wanted to rebel against Babylon. The assassination of a Jewish leader by other Jews is also marked in the Jewish liturgical calendar. The date of his death is marked on the third day of Tishrei, which is the day after Rosh Hashanah. It's also observed as a fast day in commemoration of this horrible act of intracommunal violence. Fascinatingly, in nearby Mitzvah was found some interesting seals, including this one that bears the inscription in Paleo Hebrew, Gedaliah, who is over the house, which seems to apply that Gedaliah is in charge of at least this particular estate, perhaps even larger than that. Many archaeologists have opined that this could easily belong to Gedaliah ben Achikam, the individual that we referred to earlier. So when taken all together, besides the figures we mentioned earlier in Jeremiah, it's less than 13,000 Jews were exiled to Babylon, as far as we can tell. The Babylonian exile lasted from about 586 till 539 before the Common Era, although, as we shall discuss shortly, many Jews chose not to return to Israel after 539. The situation of the Jews in Babylon is recorded in the biblical book of Ezekiel. He was a prophet who actually was active in the region. And according to his account, many of the Jewish exiles were located in the city of Nippur and also in its surrounding area. You'll notice below Nippur is the city of Shushan, or Susa, which is the setting for the book of Esther. There's some significant scholarly concerns about the specific dating of the book of Esther, meaning when does it actually happen, based on the names of certain kings and things like that. But it is set between the two temple periods, and all kinds of material inside the book of Esther is in consonance with what we know about the Babylonian reign at that time as well. The Jews living in Babylon were heavily influenced by Babylonian culture at this time, most significantly with the adoption of Aramaic as a lingua franca, as a vernacular, a language that they commonly used. And ultimately, Aramaic would displace Hebrew as the living language of the Jews, and indeed of the entire Near East at this point. This is a language that would last over 1,000 years. It is spoken even today in some parts of Syria and Turkey. It is, of course, the language of the Babylonian Talmud, and there are a few different versions of Aramaic that maybe we'll discuss in a later lecture. Hebrew was never abandoned, but it increasingly became the language of scholarship and liturgy as opposed to the daily language on the street. The Jews also adopted the Babylonian calendar, specifically the names of the months, Tishrei and Tammuz and so on. The Hebrew names for the months are simply numbers. The first month, which would be Nisan in the spring, the second month, and so on. And so the Babylonian custom of naming these lunar months was applied to the Jewish calendar. It wasn't an exact fit because the Jewish calendar has a leap month on a somewhat irregular appearing schedule. And so there are 12 months, but there is one of those months, the month of Adar, which occurs in early spring, which may be doubled. So you will have an Adar Rishon, an Adar 1, and then an Adar Sheni, a second Adar. Otherwise, they adopted the Babylonian lunar calendar names for each of the months. Okay, let us continue with our discussion of the Persian period, which will follow in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Let us now turn to the Persian period, which basically covers the period between the Persian conquest of Israel towards the end of the 6th century, taking over from the Babylonians, until the Greeks under Alexander conquered the area about 200 years later. The background to the Persian conquest of Israel is within Babylonia. You'll recall that Nebuchadnezzar invaded and destroyed Jerusalem in 586. And the situation for the Jews in remaining in the region, although a certain proportion of them were exiled to Babylonia, the situation for the Jews remaining was definitely poor. This was especially so under the reign of Nabonidus, who was the king of Babylon, also known as King of the Universe. I find that title rather amusing. And he reigned from the years 556 to 539 before the Common Era. He was an extremely pious sun worshiper. And as you can see in this particular stele, he's shown worshiping various planets there. And he actually was, a bit of a zealot, and he wanted to try and impose this kind of worship throughout his entire empire. He was known as the proponent of the cult of sin. I also think that's a rather ironic term, although I imagine sin is a translation of something else, although it is kind of funny in English. But at any rate, he was much more, we would say in Hebrew, makbid. He was much more insistent on promoting his religious view throughout the Babylonian Empire. And that turned out to be a disastrous phenomenon, because the Persians could then adopt the opposite, much more tolerant worldview and receive a lot more support as a result. One more note about Nabonidus, who actually vacated from the central capital for a decade, leaving his son Belshazzar in charge. And this is a scene from Rembrandt's famous painting, Belshazzar's Feast, which is featured in the Book of Daniel. The chronology of the Book of Daniel and the chronology of the Book of Esther are within this period, but somehow difficult to tease out. But at any rate, this famous scene shows Nabonidus' son, who is the regent, who is technically in charge of the country at this time, receives some kind of divine visitation, which then writes some Hebrew letters on the wall. This is where we get the English expression, the writing on the wall. It's a kind of an acrostic puzzle, which is fairly faithfully represented here by Rembrandt's hand. His well-known association with the Jews of Holland was definitely something that stood him in good stead when he painted these biblical passages. But basically, the message was that you are doomed. Your empire is going to be taken over by a foreign power. And in fact, that is what would happen. The Persian Empire would swallow up the Babylonian Empire. And that would include, of course, not only Israel, but even Egypt and Libya, North Africa. This map shows you the extent of the Persian Empire under Darius I, or Yavesh in Hebrew. And there's actually some numbers attached to the specific names because of a famous verse at the beginning of the Book of Esther, which describes 127 provinces. And that is, in fact, the distribution of the provinces in the Persian Empire. The one that's especially important to us is within this region called Beyond the River, which is beyond the Euphrates River, of course. You'll recall way back we talked about the word Ivri, meaning from the other side of the river. That's the name that was used for the Jews when they were in Israel, because they came from the Euphrates River. In this context, beyond the river means from the perspective of the capital, way to the east. This is beyond the river. At any rate, beyond the river, 5 provinces here, and one that's especially important is the province of...
Yo, what's up? How are you?
Good.
Excellent. I saw you called. What's up?
I just wanted to meet you.
Excellent. Are you 18? Are you 18?
No. I just got on my computer. My brother's on the PC.
That's okay. I understand. Just so you know, I generally just communicate with people who are 18. Not that I don't appreciate people who are younger, It's just that's how I choose. So when you're 18, I'd love to have as many discussions as possible with you, but not until then. I appreciate it though. Take care, Rob.
Of Yehud. Yehud obviously related to Judah, Yehudi, and the word Jew. This is the Aramaic term used by the Persians to describe the central region of the Old Kingdom of Judea. You'll notice that Samaria is a distinct population, many Jews living there as well, also Samaritans who are in conflict quite frequently with the local population. But to the south, you see Idumea, very important developments there. The nearby Edomites took advantage of some of the power vacuum to expand their hold over this province during this period. It even included Hebron, which was, a very, very important city in Jewish history. It's the burial place of Sarah, for example, and Abraham, and the Maras and Machpelah in the center of Hebron, but it was actually under Idumean control, non-Jewish control. We will see how later the Maccabees, the dynasty of the Maccabees, the Hashmonaim, would eventually expand into Idumea as well, with disastrous consequences. But at any rate, here's Yehud, and this is technically part of the Persian Empire. At this point, we're talking about the later third, the last third, the 6th century.
Hey,
now,
how are you?
As I mentioned earlier, one of the...
Welcome, Ava. I'm Rabbi Rothschild. Pleasure to have you here. How are you today? If you can speak, feel free to unmute your mic. If you just want to listen, feel free. We're just listening to history lectures.
Policies that was advanced by the Persians under Cyrus and Darius in particular was the opposite of the late Babylonian policy of religious intolerance. Rather, Cyrus promised to all the Denzians of his vast regime that they could worship as they pleased. This is recorded in a lot of documents like the Cyrus Cylinder, and a version of this tolerance of faiths is expressed in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Ezra, which describes Cyrus' essential blessing to the Jews to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild their destroyed temple, and to resume their worship there. Out of gratitude, by the way, the Jews instituted a daily worship, a daily service, a sacrifice on behalf of the emperor, which has retained its presence in the modern day liturgy in terms of the little paragraph that's inserted on the Sabbath prayers that is a public blessing for the government, meaning for the diasporic rulers in which Jews find themselves. At any rate, the Jews are very happy to return to Jerusalem, at least some of them, and to rebuild the temple as a result of Cyrus's tolerant approach. The two major figures who really stand out as society builders this time are Ezra and Nehemiah, both of whom have books in the Tanakh which are named after them. There's a lot of really interesting scholarship on the relationship between these two books and the relationship between these two people, which it would take us too far afield of where I want to go. But so let's just deal with them as one unit for the time being. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which are quite unusual stylistically as well in the Tanakh, they're much more like first-person memoirs in the way they read. They describe how Ezra and Nehemiah came to Israel in the 5th and the 6th centuries in order to try and restore Jewish society there. There were two major priorities. The first was, of course, the rebuilding of the temple, the reconstruction of it physically, and the reinstitution of the daily worship that went on there. Also related to that was a concerted effort to consolidate the modality of worship, so much so that all heterogeneous types of worship were strictly banned. And some scholars say that the Persian period is especially important in defining the future trajectory of Judaism as a whole, because under Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jews really rejected a lot of the foreign worship, and they concentrated on a particular way of understanding the Torah as a whole. Lots more to say here, but once again, very brief videos. It is important to note that, as the sages say, if there is no flour, there is no Torah, meaning there has to be some financial support to allow this to happen. The Persian royal treasury underwrote much of this activity, underwrote the reconstruction of the temple, provided tax exemptions to all the functionaries in the temple, the Levites in particular, which gave them a huge advantage in terms of their social status and their personal wealth. So there was like a real support for the effort of building the temple that came straight from the Persian Empire, at least towards the beginning of this period. Just to show you some interesting coinage from the period, this is a ma'ah. Those of you who study the Talmud will see this term comes up with some frequency. And on the right in Paleo Hebrew is the term Yehud, which means, of course, this province. And this is a very early coin from the 6th century before the Common Era. You can see on the right there is an eagle there, which has links to Persia. And on the left is, I've seen it described as a lily, which is interesting, but to my mind, does not have a huge connection with Jewish thought. I believe this is rather a representation of a lulav, the palm tree, which has huge significance. We may come back to this later, especially when I learn a little bit more about coinage, and maybe I correct myself. But for the time being, here's one coin from Yehud, and here's another one dated from the 4th century. I think this one's just fascinating. This one has a direct facial representation, rather arresting, startling facial representation of Yechezkel, the governor. But as the medieval commentator Rashi says, Kol haskalos kashos, all beginnings are difficult. And so the return to Israel was marked with some very, very difficult issues right at the very beginning. The first is, for example, there was relatively limited enthusiasm for the return to Zion under Ezra. In fact, when you look at the numbers listed, it's less than 50,000 people returned. Hard to estimate an exact percentage, but it's clearly a fraction of all the Jews who were living in Babylonia by this time. Now, to be fair, the Babylonian exile is already, it's been there for several decades, and they're well established. We have some archival evidence from some family records that suggest that Jews were involved in a whole series of types of economic activities at this time, and it's hard to simply uproot and move to a place that is it has been destroyed several decades earlier. Why would you want to do that? My family all comes to Lithuania, but I am not burning with desire to move back there. I would like to move back to Canada. I really enjoyed growing up in Canada, but to go back to my grandparents, actually my great-grandparents' homeland, I don't have the same kind of enthusiasm for it, and so I can understand the thinking of the Babylonian Jews. Also very serious, especially in Yehud itself, was that Ezra and Nehemiah mounted some social legislation that was intended to, in particular, curb the widespread intermarriage that was taking place. They felt that the intermarriage with local populations, non-Jewish wives in particular, would dilute the social glue that held the Jews together. And so they wasted no effort on a very controversial policy of banning intermarriage altogether. Ezra is associated in the Talmud with a whole series of takanot, of decrees that are aimed to try and improve Jewish family life as a whole. Intermarriage was kind of like the other side of the coin in that regard. So this period basically extends for about 200 years until Alexander the Great will invade the region, and this will mark a phenomenal impact on Jewish history because he will bring with him a series of ideas which we collectively call Hellenism that will have a major impact on Jewish history. Okay, let's return to that in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. The period we're going to begin describing right now is an extremely important period in the history of the Jews overall. And in many ways, it is a period that has had such phenomenal impact that Jews today are really still reeling from the encounter between these two very important cultures that are encapsulated by the words Athens and Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, we've dealt with extensively now. We're in lecture 18 of this series. It stands for monotheism, stands for the world of the prophets, revealed religion, all kinds of things like that. Athens, on the other hand, stands for a culture that is so radically different and so amazingly tempting, so much powerful information in Athens, that this is the first time that the Jews in Jerusalem really encountered a culture that was so powerful, not in terms of physical might, but in terms of its persuasive power, that they were fully engaged with it, and in many ways risked losing all of their own self-identity in the process. So that's really what we're going to have to talk about right now, is the development of something called Hellenism. So the term Hellenism comes from the word Hellas, meaning Greek. And in this context, I'm sort of using the shorthand of Athens because of all the Greek city-states, Athens is perhaps the most significant and has so much of the golden era of Greek culture, which flourished in the 5th and 4th and 3rd centuries in particular, that affected Jerusalem. Now, the Greeks were guests in Israel long before they were conquerors. There's no question that Hellenistic ideas were penetrating into Israel in the Persian period, but it gets a huge burst forward when Alexander the Great begins his massive conquest of the Near East and goes all the way out through Central Asia until he gets right to Afghanistan and up to the edges of India, really. He dies prematurely on his way back. His soldiers rebel against him, and there's a lot of fascinating stories about Alexander's person. But in our context, we really want to know his relationship to Israel in particular. So there is a story that is related in the Talmud. Apparently, he came to Jerusalem, and he encountered the great Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik, who convinced Alexander not to destroy Jerusalem. That much for sure is true. Jerusalem was not destroyed by Alexander, and that's a kindness. It's wonderful. Jews are generally very happy when their cities are not destroyed by conquering armies. It does not happen all that often. The legend goes that as a result, all Jews name their sons that were born in the following year Alexander after this kindness. And in fact, Alexander is a very old Jewish name as a consequence, even though it is Greek in origin, not Hebrew. In fact, my own grandfather, Olav Shalom, and one of my sons is named Alexander as a consequence of this particular interaction. But what we can say about Alexander's, presence in Israel is the fact that he brought with him Greek norms, Greek organization, Greek government, Greek economics, and Greek thought as well. And that is extremely important for our purposes because this is a period in which Jews were fully engaged in everything Greek, even to their own detriment, as we shall see. The idealized cooperation of the Greeks and the Jews is encapsulated in a rabbinic reading of a verse in Genesis that Japheth, who was one of the sons of Noah, will dwell in the tents of Shem. Shem being another son of Noah. Japheth, in the rabbinic sort of like map of the cultural world, represents Greece, and Shem represents Israel. Hence we get the term, by the way, Semite, for example, from Shem. Jews historically engaged in the thought of these philosophers in a very big way. Platonic elements can be seen in a lot of thoughts. In particular, when you look at the mystical tradition, there are a lot of ideas that are congruent with Platonic teachings. Aristotle has a very strong role to play in the way that Maimonides describes, for example, ethical behavior, the idea of the golden mean. There are some very significant differences there, but the central concept seems, really congruent. In fact, Maimonides calls Aristotle ha-philosoph, the philosopher. And it's said that Rabbeinu Yonah, a very important medieval thinker, said that Aristotle was one level shy of actually achieving Ruach HaKodesh, the divine inspiration that's associated with prophets. So there's no question, there's a lot of respect among the Jewish thinkers, really for much of the ancient and the medieval period, for the great Greek thinkers, and their philosophies were engaged in a very, very important way. One must not think that the encounter of Athens influenced only the highest intellectual levels of the Jewish community. On the contrary, there's abundant evidence to indicate that Jews as a whole saw a lot of value in Hellenistic culture and adopted it in many aspects of human life. For example, as I'm recording this video, I'm thinking a lot about the holiday of Passover. I just finished reading Tractate Pesachim in the Talmud, and there's a lot of discussion in the final chapter there about leaning. Of course, those of you who celebrate Passover, one of the elements of the Seder is that one must lean to the left while eating, which is a little bit awkward in, regular dining room chairs, especially if you don't have arms on them. But in an ancient Greek culture, this would be perfectly normal because upper class free men would typically sit on these sort of chaise lounges to eat. This is a room called a triclinium, which means three reclining, and it would be a dining room for a wealthier Greek family, specifically the men. The room was also called an andron, a men's room, literally, because it was typically men who would eat here, women would eat elsewhere. I don't think that would be entirely true in a Jewish setting, for reasons which are beyond the discussion here. But at any rate, it's very clear from the Talmudic discussion of how people are supposed to eat on Passover is that Jews are supposed to eat like free people. And their model of free people's eating is this kind of strange Greek leaning to the left. So even in common sorts of interactions like dining, like personal adornment, beauty, names, there's so many Greek names that make their way into the Jewish vocabulary, and not just great figures like Alexander, but figures like Antigonus, Ish Socho. Antigonus, clearly a Greek name. So there's no question that on all kinds of levels, in a systemic manner, Hellenism penetrated Jewish society. We see it also in terms of, for example, entertainment. The Greeks were phenomenal entertainers. Their tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides and so on, making phenomenal plays that, are still classics today. The Greek myths were so powerful and so engaging that Jews were also engaged in theatrical presentations, quite often against the wishes of the rabbis, as we shall see later. The theater was associated with inappropriate behavior in all kinds of ways, but that didn't stop the Jews from going to the theater in general. Here's a beautiful view of the theater at Caesarea that was built later on by Herod, not in the Greek period, but in the successor to the Greek period. The Romans, in many ways, followed a lot of Greek culture as well. And, Jews were frequenting the theaters, much to the consternation of the rabbis. Even things like the Sanhedrin, which is, of course, a deeply Jewish institution, the Sanhedrin being the great court of the Jews. And the idea of the Sanhedrin is already described in the Torah with gathering of a certain number, a large number, in this case you hear is 72, men to judge cases of Jewish law. But the very word Sanhedrin is Greek in origin. This is not a Hebrew term. And these are just a few examples of how Athenian culture really penetrated Jewish culture in so many ways. This was what was going to become a Kulturkampf, a culture struggle. But in the first 150 years of the Greek presence in Israel, Jews were, grabbing onto it with both hands. The period that I'm describing right now is primarily the period from Alexander the Great, about 332 before the Common Era, to Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who is the wicked king associated with the Hanukkah rebellion. That was in the year 165 before the Common Era. So we have about 150 years of this kind of, cross-fertilization of culture, and even a degree of slavish imitation of Hellenistic norms. But let me just give you a little bit of a Gedank experiment for a second. So let's say you have a bowl of chicken soup, and it's delicious. It's aromatic, and it's flavorful, and it's got so much nutrition. And so, but it's really too hot. It's too much, and it's hard to eat it when it is so hot. So you put an ice cube in there. You put a little bit of water in there, and you wait a little bit. Oh, it's still delicious. But the fact is, it's still too hot, and you really want to eat it, but it's still too hot. So you put in some more ice, a little bit more water. And at a certain point, and no one knows exactly when that point is, but at a certain point, it becomes certainly cool enough to eat, but it's no longer chicken soup. Now it is sort of chickeny water. And this is precisely the problem of the Hellenistic era for the Jews. This was a moment where the Greek culture was so overwhelming, so powerful, that they were absorbing it so heavily and were at risk of submerging their own identities and their own value. There would be a reaction to that in the period of the Maccabean revolt, which we're going to pick up in the very next video. That's basically when the more traditionalist element of Jewish society stood up and said, no, this is too much. Enough with the Greek stuff already. You are taking on so much of it that you are sacrificing core values in Judaism. So that's where we're going to pick up our story in the next video. Just want to kind of set the scene of the very powerful and tempting culture of Greece that encountered Jerusalem in the 4th century before the Common Era. Thanks very much for watching. Chances are, if you know anything about Hanukkah, you have a fairly basic understanding of this as a revolt where some Greeks, or were they somehow Syrians or somehow hyphenated Syrian Greeks, invaded the land of Israel and somehow oppressed it. And then the Maccabees rose up against them, drove them out, and then rededicated the temple, which had been defiled. And there was this miracle with some oil, and it lasted for 8 days. And so, like all Jewish holidays, they tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. That's the basic understanding of the Maccabean revolt that we tend to get in, after school classes at Talmud Torah or on Sunday mornings and things like that. But, when you actually get into the history of it, there's so much other fascinating material. First of all, we should understand that the Maccabean revolt was, at its root, essentially a civil war. It described a fissure between two large groups of Jews and how they felt they should relate to the world around them. This is a result of the political situation in which Israel had been under Greek dominance, that is Hellenistic dominance, Greek cultural dominance, since Alexander conquered the region and then died suddenly in the year 322 before the Common Era. As I mentioned in the previous video, the Greeks were guests of the Jews long before they became an occupying power. But let's just try and understand the political circumstances first. So here, if you have a look at this map, you'll see that after Alexander died, his empire was divided amongst his successors. The two empires that are especially important for us are the Seleucid Empire, which is in the yellow and occupies much of Central Asia, and the Ptolemaic Empire, which is based in Egypt. Now, the reason why the Seleucid Empire is often called the Syrian Empire, it's because much of their activity was based in what would today be called Syria. But they were fundamentally Greek in orientation. The original leaders in particular were all of Greek descent, and they were all participating in larger Hellenistic culture. But when you look more closely at where Israel is located, right here, you'll see that on this map they have cleverly labeled it both yellow and purple, because it was at the borderland between the Ptolemaic Empire based in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire based in Syria. And as a result, Israel was handed back and forth for much of the time, and only after the year 200 was it fairly firmly in the hands of the Syrian Greeks, and that's when most of the adventure of the Maccabean revolt occurs. The version of the story that you probably heard as a child had a very important role of this man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who was the leader of the Seleucid Empire between 175 and 164. He was definitely a very colorful figure. He definitely had a different approach to, shall we say, religious toleration than his predecessors had, and he was responsible for some terrible persecution of Jews in the middle of the 2nd century. He was also a bit of a madman. In fact, he had the nickname Epiphanes, means God made manifest, which is kind of like a typical name that you might want to take if you were an emperor of a large region like this. But he was known behind his back as Epimanes, which in Latin would be translated as Meshuggah. He used to do things like dress up as a commoner and then go to the bathhouses and, just try and slum it out with the regular people. And then he used to enjoy revealing himself as being, in fact, the emperor himself. And then he would ask, to have oil poured on him by everyone present. And he seems to have had a very troubled childhood, which I've talked about in a previous lecture. You can look at that if you want. At any rate, what is he specifically doing messing with Jewish religious practice? The reality is that most of these polytheistic empires were very tolerant of many different faiths, because that's really part of what polytheism is all about. You have your God, I have my God, or you, more appropriately, you have your many gods, I have my many gods. Hey, let's trade them like, hockey cards or something like that. And that's the typical response of the Seleucids and the predecessor dynasties to Judaism in general, because it was just another one of these weird Middle Eastern faiths. What do we have to bother with it? But there was a brewing controversy within Israel itself. The thing is, Antiochus inherited an internal dispute among Jews, among those who were in favor of increasing their commitment to Hellenistic values and increasing their tolerance of polytheism, which is something that traditional Judaism looked down upon very strongly. And on the other hand, there were those who were more traditionalists who said, no, this is too much. You can't take us in this direction. It was a urban-rural divide, with Jerusalem in particular being dominated by Hellenizing elements, and the countryside tending to be favored by the traditionalists. Now, Antiochus, who was stinging from some military losses and had a significant tax burden that he had to raise from his population, began to become involved in this internal dispute, because the highest office that Jews could hope to reach in Israel was the office of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. And there were two major factions who were vying for it: the Hellenists, which were favored by a man named Jason, and another even more extreme figure named Menelaus on the one hand, and the traditionalists who favored someone named Chonia, also known as Onias. The Hellenists, first with Jason and then even more so under Menelaus, offered Antiochus more tax revenues, specifically suggesting that they would raid the temple treasury itself. And so Antiochus, who otherwise would never have gotten involved in such a suit, backed the Hellenizing party, first Jason and then later Menelaus. And after one humiliating military and political defeat, Antiochus chose to press his advantage with the Hellenizing elements by ransacking the temple himself, dedicating it to Zeus rather than to the god of the Jews, and banning many traditional aspects of traditional Jewish practice, such as circumcision and the observance of the Sabbath. This sparked a revolt, but the roots of the revolt were really between the Jews themselves, between those Jews who wanted more accommodation to Hellenistic values on the one hand, and on the other hand, those who disagreed and said that the Greek world had to be held at arm's length. The Maccabean Wars were absolutely fascinating, and there were a series of battles that were primarily led by Yehuda Maccabee, an incredible figure who was a brilliant military leader who understood that the asymmetrical nature of the conflict with a large Syrian Greek army of as many as 70,000 troops simply could not be engaged in a straightforward middle of the field kind of battle. And so he pioneered a lot of fascinating guerrilla tactics in order to defeat his enemy. But let's go to the beginnings of the war. As I mentioned earlier, there was a big urban-rural divide over how Hellenistic should the Jews be. And in a town called Modi'in, some enthusiasts of the Hellenistic way of life came and ordered, in accordance with the decrees of Antiochus, that the local population should sacrifice a pig to a Greek god. A family led by Matisyahu, with his several sons, demurred, and rather than sacrifice a pig to a Greek god, which would have been an act of idolatry, they chose to sacrifice the Jewish enthusiasts who had been promoting the act of idolatry. This sparked a genuine guerrilla war where the sons of Matisyahu and he fled to the hills, quite literally the Judean mountains, and from there they engaged in small attacks on the Syrian Greek forces and, more significantly, on Jews who supported them. It's a tremendous amount of internal conflict here that made it a local conflict. The Syrian Greeks were not brought in big numbers until it was discovered that the local Jewish authorities simply could not handle them, and then increasingly large groups of real formal soldiers were brought in. This is Matisyahu himself passed away early on in the conflict, and his son Yehuda Maccabee proved to be an incredibly able general. He acquired a reputation for ferocity and brilliant strategic use of the terrain. At one particular battle early on, he seized the enemy commander's sword and he used it personally, symbolically, for the rest of the campaign. At another very important battle at Emmaus, he managed to defeat a group of regular forces who may have been as many as 4 times the size of his own ragtag band by force marching his own soldiers to attack the base when half of the enemy was out looking for Yehuda Maccabee. They set the base on fire so that when the group that was looking for Yehuda returned, they found that they were outnumbered after an exhausting search, and the entire contingent was destroyed. Remarkable strategy in battle. One of the most dramatic battles, however, was a battle that involved Greek use of war elephants, absolutely terrifying creatures. You can imagine what it must have been like that they would put some kind of fortified station on the top where more than a few soldiers could sit on top of the elephant and then attack from above. And so one of Yehuda's brothers, Elazar, thinking incorrectly as it happened, that Antiochus himself might be in one of those war elephants, Eleazar decided to attack the elephant from below and stab it, which he did successfully. However, the elephant in its death throes fell upon Eleazar and crushed him. This particular incident, by the way, was celebrated in Christian art. Let me just take you through some of them because they're just so fascinating. As you will note from this particular example, the Europeans who are describing this happens to be a 14th century German print, they don't know what an elephant actually looks like. So they sort of imagine some kind of a horse maybe, and we've got some kind of a funny nose. Okay, fine. So a big horse, and the artist obviously in this example could not believe exactly how Elazar would get underneath the horse, so he simply put him on top and striking it from above. Here is one that makes the horse look something like a, sort of a happy Doberman pinscher of some size or something like that. Amazing. This one's great. I think it has kind of like a sort of a cat-like, tiger-like look. And this one is truly original, right? It's got sort of a salamander kind of effect going on. Here's the last one, I promise. We're back to the horse again. And it looks a little bit like a Dr. Seuss kind of representation. At this point, you might be wondering, what about the miracle? What exactly happened with the miracle? So this is the part that usually gets first billing, but in the historical sources, it actually gets remarkably little billing. So ultimately, after a series of reversals over several years, we're actually not speaking about 1, 2, or 3 battles. We're talking about a long, drawn-out conflict that took several years to resolve. Eventually, Yehuda was able to take back Jerusalem, take back the temple grounds, cleanse it of all of the Antiochus-inspired idolatry, and restore it back to its original function as a monotheistic site of worship of God. Let us recall that the very name Chanukah means dedication, in the sense of dedicating the temple. And one of the key elements is the menorah, which is shown here in the famous Arch of Titus. This is a piece of Roman monumental art that commemorates the defeat of Judea by the Romans in the 1st century, a little more than 200 years later. And as you can see here, they're carting away the spoils from the temple, including the menorah, the gold candelabra. This is, by the way, more or less how it looks today. But Stephen Fine of Yeshiva University has done some chemical analysis of paint flecks and has been able to determine that it would have originally appeared to Romans like this in a painted version, which personally I actually like the way we have it today. It's much less garish and so on. But here you can see on the left, there's a sign, the law of the Jews in Latin, which presumably would have been some kind of representation of the Torah. And then you can see labeled the candelabra of the Jews, of course, the menorah, and on the right, the holy thing of the Jews, which may have been the shulchan, the table, or perhaps part of the altar, something like that. At any rate, none of the earliest sources have a really clear description of the miracle, which seems to get such high billing. The earliest source that we have for the description of this miracle is a baraita that occurs in the Talmudic tractate of Shabbat, page 21b to be precise. A baraita or baraisa is essentially a statement which is ancient in nature and as an oral tradition is handed down, but it was not included in the important collection of teachings that was brought together in the early 3rd century by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So it's difficult to date the Baraita very well, but that is essentially the place where we get the source of the story of the oil that continued to burn for 8 days when it should only have burned for 1. There are other elements in other early sources, such as the Megillat Ta'anit, which is a scroll of fast days that lists not really fast days per se. It mainly lists days in which fasting is not permitted. And other early sources do make reference to the need for a new menorah, the need for some kind of way of kindling lights, presumably because of the defilement, but the 8-day story is actually not represented there. What is interesting on top of this, however, is that the Megillat Ta'anit and others note the date of this event is the 25th of Kislev. That's the first night of Hanukkah, is on the 25th of Kislev, which happens to be the exact date that the Antiochus first defiled the temple. And so it is an anniversary of the defiling of the temple that marks the rededication, the Chanukah of the temple once again. So what I would like to say about all this is that the miracle of the oil is fascinating, and there's a lot of interesting things written on it. But in my humble opinion, the most significant thing, at least from a historical perspective, is this incredible military victory that represents an assertion of Jewish independence from religious persecution, quite arguably the first such successful rebellion against religious persecution in recorded history. That's an amazing thing, and that's an amazing miracle. The story does not end with the dedication of the temple. Yehuda Maccabee's earliest supporters were called Hasidim, meaning pious ones. And these were the traditionalists who really wanted to get rid of all these Hellenizing elements and so on. And they followed him with tremendous zeal and with tremendous self-sacrifice. You know, the book of the Maccabees describes some amazing stories about the lengths that they would go to, like Eliezer, in order to defend their religious values. And Yehuda HaMaccabee's remarkable serial successes could only bolster their support for him and for the importance of his mission. However, he had so much early success that ultimately the Greeks had to sue for peace. They did not, however, simply leave the country. And in fact, the Maccabees would not have full independence, that is, including economic independence and the freedom from paying tribute, that is, taxes to the Syrians, for another 20 years. They wouldn't get that until long after Yehuda was gone in the year 142, and even then, only briefly. So we're not talking about a full political independence. What happens is the Syrian Greeks realize soon that fighting in this local conflict over whether or not the temple is Hellenistic in nature is really not in their interests. Antiochus has died. There are succession conflicts over who's going to take over after him. And so the general Lysia says, you know what? Let's have a do-over. I say we go back to status quo. Obviously, Antiochus had overstepped his boundaries and had banned your traditional practices like circumcision and observing of Shabbat. And I know he messed up your temple. You really didn't like that. So how about we just go back to the way it was before 167, before all this happened? And Yehuda said, no way. Yehuda Maccabee, who was, zealous for the cause of Jewish nationalism and Jewish religious freedom to the utmost, he said, no way. Tolerance is not enough. We want you gone. However, he lost the backing of his most ardent supporters who said, status quo ante, that actually sounds pretty good. In other words, the Hasidim felt that it wasn't really worth it to keep fighting the Syrian Greeks when what they really wanted was religious freedom. As long as they were free to do what they wanted with Shabbat and with circumcision and with the temple ritual, okay, so we have to pay taxes to somebody. We'll pay it to the Greeks. What's the big deal? And so Yehuda actually lost some of his main supporters because the majority of the people, although they were incensed at the idea of an infringement on their religious values, once those religious values were left alone and they went back to status quo ante, they were prepared to abandon Yehuda. And there's much more to say about the political fallout of that decision, but ultimately that's what happened. Lysias put in another Kohen Gadol named Alcimos, who was actually much more amenable to the Hasidim than Menelaus, who was ultimately executed. And they were prepared to manage with the Greeks at arm's length, which was in many ways the end of the Maccabean revolt, even though Yehuda would press the issue further and